during the process of revolution and liberation of the marginalized communities in India, which constitute the lower, quote unquote, lower class people, yeah, backwards class people. There are several terms that are used. Other backward classes, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and nomadic tribes, yeah, and several others, which constitute this lower caste, lower class. Shudra is another word that is used, untouchables. You probably are familiar with a lot of these terms. And to liberate themselves from the shackles of the hierarchical Hinduism structure, they decided to accept and embrace Buddhism in this new form called Navayana Buddhism, which revolved a lot around fighting for their rights as a citizen of India, yeah, to be treated as a respectful person, just like anyone else there. That's where this started. The Dalits is a word that is modernly acceptable and used to address this community. Yeah. But in this case, meditation took a backseat because there's survival that was at stake. So people didn't have the room or space to do traditional Buddhist practices besides ritualism, which became an identifier for this community. Ritualism meaning when a child is born, when they get married, particular rituals during the continuation or when people leave their body, which created identifiers for these people. But meditation slowly is coming back to this community, the Navayana Theravada Buddhist community in India. Just wanted to say a few words to bring awareness to this particular topic, which is relevant for us who are Indians here in Desi Rainbow. But having said that, we'll have a chance for Q&A more, but I'd like to hear or allow us to hear from Bhante Tashi and engage with them a little bit. Yeah, so Bhante Tashi, when you're ready.
Thank you, Tushar. Thank you for setting the tone of it by actually introducing and talking about Navayana Buddhism and the context of it. I think it's necessary, important, and essential. I think when we talk about Buddhism, often it is Mahayana and Theravada, and Navayana doesn't get really mentioned, at least in the larger Buddhist context. So thanks for that. So firstly, of course, thanks to Desi Rainbow Parents and Allies and for all the community coming together and actually organizing it. My gratitude and thanks to all of you. And also a disclaimer, which I often do give in most of the places I engage with, that please do not be misled by my robes. I really don't have much of wisdom to share. If anything, I have stories and opinions probably, and some understandings and learnings passed down from my teachers. That's it, nothing else. So talking about Buddhism and queerness as a queer trans person and as a Buddhist, what I'm going to say is not something that I'm saying newly as such, but something that I firmly believe in, and I often say in most of the gatherings, that I do not kind of really see, I do recognize the differences between different ideologies, but at the same time, talking about queerness in Buddhism, it's also a challenge for me personally as individually, because not because it is faith in queerness and talking about it is challenging, but because being a Buddhist monastic and a queer and trans person, which is both of being an integral part of my life. So in Buddhist world, often my transness and queerness gets invisibilized, and in my among trans communities, it is my transness that gets invisibilized because I don't look trans in certain way. So that makes it challenging. But putting that aside, even in the struggle, I also find certain comfort seeing how both Buddhism and queerness share certain things in common. I think certain very powerful things in common. Not just because there are Buddhists who are queer people like me, or vice versa, but because something like Buddhism, as Dhamma, as a philosophy, as Buddha's teachings, which often helps the practitioners and people who study and practice Buddhism to question the worldview that we all hold so dearly, I think. about suffering, about nature of reality, about mind, about human nature, so on. And I think queerness also serves a similar kind of purpose. It also helps us question the status quo, the very status quo that often the mainstream holds very dear and very set in stone, that everything is fine kind of illusion that seem to be prevalent. As simple as queerness helps us relook at family. What is a family? What are the bounds and limits of love, companionship, intimacies? It helps us look at and question traditions, customs, in general, the potential of us as communities to exist and share, I think, to live, to create a new world. So Buddha's teachings in that sense lays a path for freedom, from suffering, the ultimate freedom from suffering. And queerness does the same in a very conventional sense, I think. The former, the Buddhist teachings and the Buddha Dhamma, helps us the ultimate freedom from suffering, whereas the queerness helps us to become free from the systemic structural suffering that humans have created and continue to create in our everyday reality. That is something what I find extremely close and common between both Buddhism and queerness, and that's where I don't see them in conflict with each other much. In fact, as a Buddhist, of course, many people often ask, how is it to be a trans person, queer person, and live in Buddhist community? Well, as much as I'm a Buddhist, whatever I say about Buddhism in niceness, it could certainly be biased, because I certainly have faith. I certainly feel extremely benefited. It helps me live my everyday life, survive, live, and thrive in various ways. But at the same time, I think Buddhism also, like any other institutionalized faith, has flaws, limitations, pitfalls. And the Tibetan Buddhism that I practice is no exception in that sense. Buddhism is largely built after Buddha or around Buddha, on Buddha's teachings in a patriarchal world. So there is patriarchy, there is misogyny, there is sexism, there is even Buddhist nationalism in countries like Sri Lanka and Burma. So Buddhism also has its limitations as an organized faith, and it requires critical outlook. So I often talk in the communities and share that it is my faith as a young person, young adult, that helped me to come to terms with my queerness. And I feel it is my queerness and our collective queerness that actually is something that is going to help religious places, communities, faith communities become inclusive. And especially, I believe queerness, as much as Buddhism has so much to offer all of us, I believe queerness also has a lot to offer Buddhism in terms of making Buddhism free of patriarchy, sexism, misogyny. I think queer people and queerness as a lived reality can play a very significant and important role. So that's where I feel both can be mutually benefited from each other. And that's something, having said that, at the same time, I also believe there is conflict, there is challenge, because there are scriptures that do talk about homosexuality as a sexual misconduct. There are scriptures that talk about how enlightenment happens only in a male body, right? And there are teachers who also do believe in certain things. Now, if not all of them, certainly many of them do. So one thing that I think all of us have to remain aware when we are of a person of faith, I believe, no matter how deeply we're invested in it. One sense of investment, in fact, one sense of responsibility must and should be that we critically look at the faiths that we practice. And Buddhism should not be an exception. If we don't look at the faith that we practice critically, it, I believe, to be an injustice to the faith that we practice. It is limiting to the faith that we practice. So the critical outlook at the faith that we practice is very essentially important. And thankfully, Buddha himself has said long ago that please do not take my teachings at my face value, but rather analyze, question, investigate, apply your rational, logical mind and see if it makes sense. right? And I don't think Buddha said it just for the sake of being humble and nice and, but Buddha said it because when he was teaching Dhamma, he was teaching Dhamma to a particular time, context, cultural context and setup. And many people would like to believe, I don't really see Buddha as a radical. If anything, I see Buddha as a skillful person who tackled many things, but his primary agenda was to teach Dhamma back then, not really entirely to tackle social evils. He did in his own way, but that was not his primary agenda, I believe. That's why I think he laid the caution when you engage with the Dhamma, engage with it critically and not simply with some sense of blind faith and devotion to the Buddha. So in that sense, in fact, in most of the Tibetan traditions, it's often described that a faith that is out of just belief is one kind of faith, and a faith that is actually based on rational, logical thinking is a faith that is much more stronger, and the faith that is much more needed going forth and practicing, Buddhist teachings and Buddha's teachings. So in that sense, it leaves room in Buddhism, at least, for to question. And no one can really come around and say that Buddha said so, teacher said so, scripture said so. That doesn't work much. So there is room and space for that. But nonetheless, of course, like I said, it has pitfalls, it has conservatism. There are orthodox traditions within Buddhist faith. I remember first when I walked into a monastic community, this was a monastic community where monks and nuns were living together. And I'm a male-bodied person. I'm a male-assigned gender at birth person. And the moment I walked into the first day into the Gompa for the prayer session, where the senior nuns who have been ordained for 20, 40 years, asked me to go and sit in front because I'm a male-bodied person, and that should be the seniority, even though I've been just ordained a month old. I had to tell them, hey, in that case, I'm a trans person. Probably I'm going to go in the very back at the end in the hierarchy line. So these are the conversations that we continue to have. That's something that I appreciate, that there is room for those conversations. These are my at least initial thoughts right now. So I'll stop myself over here.
This is very helpful to hear, Bhante Tashi, and I want to invite you to take care of yourself, because in case some of these thoughts and ideas, they bring up certain emotions in you, particularly the emotions related to how you feel in a particular group or community, whether that is a Buddhist community or any other communities. So please take care of yourself and acknowledge the way you're feeling right now, and maybe observe a few seconds of silence to contemplate what is arising in you upon hearing these words from Bhante Tashi.